This is They Create Worlds, episode 252, A Guitar Hero.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you once again to talk about what everyone really comes to video games for, the music. Not just any kind of music, interactive music, where you get to play on drums, guitar, and actually learn how to be a real musician and a rock star. Or, if you fail, we'll just send you to resort number 7, and you will never be seen or heard from again.
That's right. In this episode, we are going to take a brief look at the fad that was Guitar Hero and its competitor Rock Band, with really our main emphasis being on the beginning of the Guitar Hero series rather than going beat by beat in detail across every game. Certainly a topic near and dear to my heart. I was a huge fan of those games, still am. Bought so much DLC for Rock Band back in the day, and created a band in Rock Band that was loosely based on a D6 campaign, near future dystopian kind of campaign that was being run by Jeffrey here back in the day. Oppressive government would send off the special people to resorts, and we had to rescue someone once from resort number 7, and that was the name of our band. So that's that reference. We don't give out bonus points for that because there's only like 4 people in the world that would even know what we were talking about.
Oh, come on. Everyone should just know what's going on through our head just by mere osmosis of knowledge transfer, because we just, talk and people learn stuff.
That's right. Respect the lore. But that's right. It was a very important series, especially Guitar Hero, Rock Band as well, but especially Guitar Hero was a very important series. The end of the aughts, the beginning of the 2010s, put harmonics on the map. In some ways, it put Activision on the map, even though Activision was obviously already a big publisher, as we've talked about in our Bobby Kotick episodes. It made it in some ways an even bigger publisher. Yeah, it was a good time. So seems like a good topic to discuss here on They Create Worlds, where apparently we talk about video games from time to time. I don't know. I just work here.
We're just going away from video games and we'll just be a music podcast. Sure. We'll do that.
Oh, God.
Where do we go with Rock Band? Because I know it's not just a company here. This is a publication under other companies. So how do we want to attack this one?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The origin of Guitar Hero is such a fascinating story because it's something that should have never worked. It was inexperienced companies, inexperienced publishers, really expensive product in really big boxes that retailers hate, in a genre that had never caught on in a big way in the United States. The thing should have failed, but the game was so fun and its sequels were so fun that once it got into people's hands, it overcame all of these obstacles and for a brief period of time became a billion with a B dollar business. So we really need to start with the companies that were behind the game and start really with the company that had the idea for the game in the first place. That was a very tiny, not an exaggeration, company by the name of Red Octane. Red Octane was, at its inception, a completely unremarkable .com business swimming in a sea of .com businesses right at the tipping point right before the entire .com bubble collapsed. It was founded by 2 brothers, Kai and Charles Huang. They got the idea during this whole kind of .com rush period to do a game rental service. They weren't the only people that had this idea. Gamefly was another one doing this. Netflix, of course, was doing this in DVD rentals at the time as well. So not a completely original idea, but the idea is basically you want games. You can't afford games. You don't have a good way to get games in your local area. We can give you games for a membership. You can select games and we will send them to you in the mail. And then when you're done, you send them back. They had a site called Web Game Zone, and they were doing these game rentals.
Sort of like Netflix.
Exactly. Kind of like what Netflix was doing at the same time. It was the .com bubble, so everyone was doing online kinds of businesses of all types. The business never really took off. It was never very successful. Then on top of that, of course, the .com bubble collapsed. So investment was drying up in the sector basically just as soon as they got into the business. It was a horrible time to get in. It was a horrible idea. The company should have failed. The company should have failed very quickly. But they did discover one little niche that they could get into that kept the company going. This was in the later days of the PlayStation, of the original PlayStation, the PS1. The PS1 was not region locked like later consoles would be. So you could actually play imported Japanese games on American PlayStations. So as part of their game rental business, they weren't just offering games that were available in the US, they were also purchasing games from Japan and making those available for rental as well. What they discovered was that there was a small but dedicated underground scene in the United States that was very interested in the Konami game Dance Dance Revolution. DDR, for short, of course, is one of the seminal Konami Bemani games, the various rhythm games that the company put out in the mid-1990s and beyond. We talk about this some on our Konami episode. We don't really have a lot of insight, at least not in the sources available to us here in the West, on the development of those games. But DDR was incredibly popular in Japanese game centers. It was a full-blown phenomenon, and it really put rhythm gaming on the map in that market. There had been some other rhythm games, some of which we'll talk about in a second. We're not doing a whole history of rhythm games in this episode, but we'll talk about a couple things in a second here. It wasn't the first rhythm game, wasn't the first successful rhythm game, but it kind of blew that business up to an entirely new level. It was very much a local Japanese phenomenon or Asian phenomenon. It really wasn't a Western phenomenon. This was a period of time when American game centers were in decline, when a lot fewer coin-op games were being placed on location. It was a big, expensive cabinet. You could find them in the United States, but it wasn't widespread in the United States. However, even though it wasn't the same phenomenon in the US that it was in Japan, those that were into it were really into it. So it was popular in its own way. It just wasn't the same mainstream phenomenon at this point in time in the West that it was in Japan. Because of that, Konami wasn't particularly interested in supporting it or publicizing it or extending it in the United States, which left a gap in the market. So they released a home version of the game. But that home version of the game, which came out in Japan in 1999, didn't come out in the United States until 2001. So there was this period of time where you couldn't get the game for the home. And obviously, there was a lot of interest in having a home version of DDR by these arcade freaks, not just because they could play it more, but also because they could get in a lot of practice at home as well, then show off better, save money, whatever, at the arcade when they go out on the town. Red Octane found pretty quickly that DDR was a popular rental title. But there was another problem, which is that to really play Dance Dance Revolution properly, you could technically play it with a controller using inputs, but that's not the way you play DDR now, is it, Jeffrey?
No. You kind of use certain other body parts, like feet or hands.
Exactly, particularly feet. For the home, when Konami released the game, they also released a dance pad that mimicked the setup of the coin-op game's dance pad that people used to play the game. And because Konami wasn't releasing or supporting any of this in the United States, you could not get those dance pads in the United States. Red Octane was renting the game, but they couldn't really rent dance pads. Too fragile, too annoying to ship, more expensive. Like, there's a lot of reasons why you can't do that. But one of their employees, Andrew Kim, hit upon the idea of, well, this is really popular. what if we sold DDR dance pads, DDR dance mats to people that are interested in all of this? We can buy them from Japan. We can stick our own Red Octane label on them, and we can sell these things to this small niche crowd that is very interested in this DDR game. They decided to do that. They began selling them, and it was incredibly successful for them. Like, they're still going to be a small company because even this being an incredible success, it's still a niche market. You know, they could sell these things for about $100. It was an expensive peripheral, which in general, expensive peripherals don't do very well on the market. But it was tied into a very specific craze. And then they were also able to play up the fitness angle of it and do a PR campaign around it that was focused around kids losing weight playing the game, which got them in with schools a little bit and gave them kind of this positive image. They were able to sell a decent number of these dance mats, and away they go. They started doing other peripherals as well, and so they kind of had this small peripheral business going. From there, they wanted to expand a little bit. They had visions of becoming even bigger. They ended up going in with a small Austin, Texas company called Roxor Games that had created their own DDR clone in the Groove. Because again, Konami wasn't really supporting any of this in the United States. So there were other small companies that were popping up, not just Red Octane, that were trying to support this kind of nascent DDR thing that was going on in the market. Roxor had a DDR clone in the Groove, an arcade game. They were wanting to port that into the home. Red Octane ended up contacting them because they were both in this kind of dance game business, and they ended up working together, and Red Octane ended up publishing this in the Groove game. This did not go well because at the end of the day, still, rhythm games, music games were not popular in the US. Not really. They don't sell well. Yeah, there were some very dedicated Dance Dance Revolution scenes around arcades, and there were some really dedicated people that were into this kind of thing.
I know. My sister was really big into it. She actually got one of those metal Dance Dance Revolution home pads and used that to play it, especially during college.
Yeah, and our friend Steve as well was very into it and had a pad as well, I believe. So, you know, I mean, the people that liked it really liked it, but it wasn't a mainstream kind of thing. So the publication of this game didn't go very well. And then to make matters worse, Konami ended up suing because they said it violated some of their patents that they had taken out on this kind of game. That suit was filed in May 2005, settled in October 2006. So yeah, this didn't go very well, but the Red Octane folks were still convinced, because they'd had some success in this area, that a music game of some kind could be successful in the United States if they just hit on the right idea. You know, there were some other games out there by this time in the Bimani series in Japan and in limited quantities in the United States. One of those was a guitar game called Guitar Freaks. Very simple, follow along, pretend you're playing the guitar kind of game. They thought that maybe had a better chance of being more mainstream in the US. They were thinking something with guitar or drums would be best because that just fit the American sensibility more. But Guitar Freaks was very generic in concept. I mean, obviously you're playing along with a guitar, but it didn't really have an aesthetic to it. It had pop songs, it had jazz songs, it had all sorts of different kinds of music and very generic aesthetics. So they were like, a guitar game might be interesting, but we need something more of a hook. We need something more interesting if we're going to do this. And they thought that the great way to do a guitar game would be to focus around the idea of the player as a rock star. You're not just playing along to guitar notes appearing on the screen. You are embodying a rock star experience. They just thought that that would fit better with the American aesthetic.
You definitely have that here.
Yeah.
Think of Bill and Ted.
Sure.
You got the garage band. A couple of teenagers want to just be our own band, do our own thing, get discovered, become super famous and popular. The amount of people who that success for them, very small, but there were a lot of people who tried it, at least for a few years. There's certainly a certain segment of the population that has experienced that and can go back to, yeah, I remember the time when I used to try to be in my own little band with some friends. I can sort of relive that with this game.
Yeah, absolutely. And rock and roll has been in long, slow decline as a genre, but certainly in this time period, even in the early 2000s, rock and roll maybe wasn't what it was in, say, the 1970s. There was still a strong rock and roll vibe going on. I mean, emo and some of the later punk and all of that stuff were still resonating with a portion of the youths. So yeah, it just seemed like the kind of thing that could bring this kind of music sensibility to the United States, because obviously music games are very popular in Japan. Music in general has wide appeal, and this seemed like it could be the hook. So they wanted to publish a guitar-centric rhythm game about embodying the experience of being a rock star. But they're not a developer. They are a publisher. They're barely a publisher. They want to be a publisher. They have a small peripheral business. They tried one little publishing thing that didn't work out. They're a small fry, nothing company. But they have big dreams, and they need a developer. So they end up turning to another company that is kind of small, but with big dreams. And our other major protagonist in this story, Harmonix Music Systems. Harmonix was never meant to be a game company. It was founded by two MIT graduates right out of graduate school in 1995 by the name of Alex Rigopoulos and Iran Egozi. I'm sure I butchered that. Iran Egozi, who had been working in the MIT Media Lab when they were in graduate school. They came from slightly different backgrounds. Aaron was a programmer. He had been into computers for a long time. He had had an Apple II back in the day. He'd done programming in assembly language when he was younger. Very traditional kind of computer nerd who'd been programming as a hobbyist since junior high. But he was also very interested in music. He was a classically trained clarinetist. He played classical music. He wasn't the rock star type. He played the clarinet. So even though he was an electrical engineering, computer science guy, because of his music interest, he was very, very interested when he discovered the Media Lab, which was a place at MIT where there was a combination of doing programming and doing music. The idea is you're doing computer projects related to music and media. Alex Rigopoulos came at it from the other direction. He was a music composition major. He was not primarily a programmer. He did do some hobbyist programming, again, starting in junior high school. But he never wrote a line of machine code in his life, and it was never something that he was ever really going to do as a day job, being an engineer, being a computer scientist, working on computer stuff. However, he also knew that he really wasn't that good a composer. That's in his own words. He was never a very good composer, so he also knew that, that was his major, but he also knew he wasn't going to be able to do that for a living. He was starting to look around for realistically, what exactly am I going to do? So he also discovered the MIT Media Lab, this computer music space, and was working there as well, and the two of them met there and became friends there. And were working together on a concept to allow anybody, any person, any individual, to feel like they were creating music. Because, it's fascinating, and both Alex and Aaron have talked about this in interviews, and it's just it's self-evident even beyond that. Music is deeply, inextricably tied to the human experience. As animals, not just as people, but as animals, as creatures, there is something fundamental that attracts us to music and making music and tapping out rhythms and humming and singing and wanting to be creative in that way. They believe that music is older than language. Anthropologists and whoever else is studying this believe that we had music before we even had language. There's something innate and primal about that draws us in. Most of us aren't necessarily very good at it. I'm not speaking for myself. I like to think I'm a pretty good singer. But most people are not. And especially when it comes to playing an instrument. I mean, I was a percussionist in school. I never tried to take up, one of them fancy instruments like a clarinet or a trumpet or a guitar or anything like that.
And I'd play piano.
Yeah, but I haven't had any of them published yet, so I'll warn you, I'm in a mean mood.
Why was I thinking the same thing? Why? Why? It's like we've known each other way too long.
It's almost like we've known each other for many decades. Yes, indeed. Bonus points if you get that reference. But, most people at some point in their lives, not everybody, but most people, try at some point to pick up an instrument of some kind. Most of them maybe fiddle around with it for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and then give it up, which there's no shame in. I mean, playing a musical instrument as opposed to singing, if you happen to have that talent, is so much more difficult. There's a lot to learn. You have to train your brain in a certain way. You have to train your hands in a certain way. It's not easy. And so people are drawn to wanting to play an instrument because just as human beings, that's something we're drawn to, but they're not very good at it for the most part. So people try and set it down. And Alex and Aaron were both people that were musicians. Aaron much more accomplished than Alex, at least to hear Alex tell it, though for all I know, he's being a little modest. They knew what it was like, the experience of playing an instrument and playing an instrument fairly well, and they wanted everyone else to experience that as well. So they were working on technology at the Media Lab that would allow anyone to feel like they were playing music. They were working on a program that would generate music on the fly algorithmically and would accept a certain amount of user input to modify the music that's playing. So it would put down a backing track, and then it would allow you to solo with an instrument on top of that backing track. Various inputs would change the speed and the notes and all of this stuff of what you're playing. And then there was a lot of math and programming going on under the surface to algorithmically blend your inputs in with what's going on. And so you would feel like you were actually altering the music. They ended up using a joystick input for this solely because at one point, Alex was really kind of into flight simulators, which were still a thing back then. We're talking about the early 90s when flight simulators and playing games with joysticks was still a thing. For our younger listeners, that'd be like, what? A joystick? But pretty popular in the early 90s. They got the idea as Alex was playing flight simulators with a joystick. It's like, we could use a joystick like this to do this music thing. That was their big project that they were working on as graduate students at MIT. So graduation's coming up. As with anyone who's graduating, the question is, well, what happens now? Aaron, who was a true engineering type, was just going to go out into the world and probably get a boring engineering job someplace. That wasn't going to do for Alex. Alex was in music composition, but he wasn't really much of a composer. He was in the Media Lab doing some tech stuff, but he really wasn't that much of a tech guy. What he really wanted to do was to keep doing what he was doing at the Media Lab, which was working with this technology they had developed and try to figure out ways to connect people with music. Not in a game sense, because this thing they're working on, it's on a computer, but it's not a game. There's no points, there's no score, there's no objective, there's no rating. It's just, here's a program that you can boot up and you can make music with it. Just like someone who is more musically talented can sit down at a piano and just start making music with it. Like, it's not a game in any way. They are not contemplating being a game company at all. But they do want to connect people with music, and specifically people who aren't necessarily able to connect with music through the normal way of spending years and years studying an instrument. So Alex convinces Aaron that they should go into business together. Their technology had gotten a lot of good, positive buzz while they were at the lab. Not just from people in the academic community, but there were corporate sponsors of the lab as well. A couple that Alex mentioned in one interview were Sega and Yamaha, as example. Some of these corporate sponsors were very interested in the technology too, so they'd gotten some response to this. So Alex convinced Aaron, it's like, let's do this. Let's go into business together and keep working on this. And Aaron was like, sure. So in 1995, they established Harmonix Music Systems. They raised a very small amount of money from friends and family, about $100,000. Alex, at this point, was still living with his parents. Aaron, in his own words, was still living like a graduate student, which means poor. Even though it was a very small amount of money, they had very few of their own living expenses, so they were able to scrimp by with that in the beginning. They ended up developing this product to fruition and released it under the name the Axe. Axe being a colloquial term for a guitar. It was a complete flop. an absolute, in their own words, horrendous failure. Sold about 300 copies, and I don't think they would be surprised if 200 of those people wish they had never bought it. They'd gotten all of this good buzz on it, but the problem was it was great fun to fool around with. Like, you would sit down at this thing and you'd start fiddling with the joystick and the music would be responding to you, and it was incredible. You really felt like you were, in a way, making music. And then the novelty of that wore off, and after about 15 minutes, you were done. There was only so much you could do with it, and there was no objective, no missions, no goals. You were done.
You had a gameplay loop without the loop.
Right. Everyone thought it was amazing for about 15 minutes, and then they were done. But, as is always the case through Harmonix's history, even though it didn't work out, one thing would continually lead to another and keep them stringing along just long enough until they finally figured out what they were really supposed to be doing with their lives. So the Axe failed, was released on CD-ROM for PC, but Disney got wind of it, and they were interested in this basic premise of this thing about being able to, with simple inputs, feel like you're creating music, manipulating music. They were interested in having a similar installation in the Innovations exhibit at Epcot at Walt Disney World in Florida. Even though the Axe failed, it did get them a contract in 1998 with Disney. They basically created the same thing, except instead of using a joystick, it used infrared sensors, so you just moved your hand. So it was, kind of a cool little thing. Like, you move your hand up, and the pitch goes up. You move your hand down, and the pitch goes down. Again, it's the kind of novelty that's only going to entrance you for like 5 or 10 minutes, and then you're done. But in the context of going through Epcot, spending a day at Epcot, and doing a bunch of little things all over the amusement park, that's fine. 5 to 10 minutes of being like, that was kind of cool, works. Of course, in their own words, this led them down a completely blind path that they should have never gone down. Because they were like, oh, okay, Disney's interested in this. That means our problem was that this wasn't meant to be a home product. This was meant to be a location-based entertainment product. So that is the industry that we should be in. We should be dealing with arcades, amusement parks, museums that have interactive displays. Like, we're really making this kind of interactive thing that is for these locations providing entertainment. Well, that didn't work either. There's maybe a world where that could theoretically work for somebody. But again, in their own words, a lot of this comes from an interview that they gave to CNN many years ago. A lot of this episode is based on an oral history of Guitar Hero that was originally put out on the website Vice and then was more recently turned into a book by Blake Hester, which goes into the origin of the series. But a lot of the background on Harmonix comes from a separate interview that they gave to CNN many, many years ago. And in their words, the problem was that these were industries that moved very slowly, particularly amusement parks and museums. So it would take 12 to 18 months before you could even get a deal to make something. It was so slow moving, and they couldn't survive on that. They needed money coming in at a more consistent rate than that. It was a horrible idea. So then they hit on their next brilliant idea, karaoke in Japan. Because again, they still think, okay, this clearly doesn't work in the home, but as something that you do for just a few minutes in like a location, it can work. So they were like, we've got this software that allows for improvisation, very easy improvisation by anybody, even if you don't have the musical talent. So what if we adapted this to karaoke? And we could introduce our software into karaoke systems in Japan. At this time, karaoke really isn't a huge thing in the United States, so they really are looking at Japan. What if we introduce this into karaoke in Japan so that people, while they're doing their karaoke, can do improvisation and seem really cool? So they went around Japan looking for interested investors and buyers. They got some interest, though, as they put it themselves, they didn't understand Japanese business culture and didn't realize that a lot of that interest was just to be polite. The way Japanese businesses work is very different from American businesses. I don't claim to be an expert, but a lot of it is around the idea of saving face. So you don't want to embarrass somebody by telling them no. You want to continue to tell them yes until they get the hint that you're not actually interested, and then they go away on their own. It's kind of this whole face-saving culture kind of thing. Yes often means no in Japan because they're just being polite. So they actually went down this rabbit hole a lot longer than they should have because they thought that they were getting interest when, in point of fact, everyone was just being polite. This took them through like 98 and 1999 where they were trying to do this. Really, in their words, the reason this wasn't working is karaoke is not about improvisation. Like, there are a lot of settings where it can be fun to improvise music. But the basic idea of karaoke, and especially how it's practiced in Japan, I mean, it's true in the States too, but I think it's even more true in Japan. The point of karaoke is to replicate the original song as closely as you possibly can. If you are improvising, you are not replicating the original song. That's bad.
Yeah, that might be a problem.
So there really wasn't any interest in this. A cool idea, perhaps, but the absolutely wrong marketplace for it. But again, even though they're down all of these blind alleys, one thing always leads them to another. The axe failed, but at least they kept going a little while longer by getting a Disney contract. The Disney contract led them down a blind path where they were trying to do location-based entertainment, which didn't work, but that got them to Japan. In Japan, they saw the rhythm scene that was developing there. They got a sense for not just the Bimani games, but also especially Parappa the Rapper on the PlayStation, which is one of the foundational games in what we would call the rhythm genre. I mean, there had been other isolated examples of rhythm games before that, but Parappa was the first rhythm game that really had mainstream appeal. But again, it was mostly in Japan. It did come out in the United States, but in the United States, it was just kind of a cult classic. In Japan, it was a legitimate hit on the PlayStation. What Parappa showed them is that people really like being able to follow along with music. It doesn't have to be all of this crazy improv stuff. Parappa the Rapper is really pretty simple. It's a call and response kind of game where a character is rapping and then you are doing button presses to follow their rap. It's very simple, but it's easy to get into. It had catchy tunes. It had a wonderful, delightful, cutesy art style, primarily the work of Rodney Greenblatt. So it drew people in and it gave them a goal and it was accessible and it was super popular, at least in Japan. United States, West, a little bit more of a cult classic. This is what finally clicked in their heads. It's like the way to connect ordinary people with music is to make games. It's not about just making them feel like they're a musician. It's about making it feel like they are interacting with music combined with aesthetic and progress and score and activity. You keep them engaged with a gameplay loop. As you said, the axe is a loop without a loop. Parappa has a gameplay loop that's very satisfying, backed by an aesthetic that makes it very accessible. So they finally realized that what they really were supposed to be all along was a game company. They'd never planned to be one. It was not their goal. But now, here we are, 1999, and it's like, oh, I guess that's what we were actually supposed to be. You know, by this time, the company's hurting. They've never had a success. They barely made any money. They'd gotten a little more. They'd picked up a little more investment here and there, but they weren't doing very well. So at this point, they laid off about 40% of their staff and pivoted to starting to bring in people that had more game experience. They were in a great place to do this because they were Boston folks. Boston had a small but very vibrant game development scene that went back several decades. Companies like Infocom and Parker Brothers had a major presence there, and Activision had had a development studio there. More recently, you had Blue Sky / Looking Glass and some of the companies that had spun off from there. So there was actually a pretty healthy development community there. The first person, as far as I know, that they brought in from the game business, actually was even before this, it was at the very end of 1997, was a guy by the name of Mike Dornbrook, who had been a very, very, very early person at Infocom. He was not a game developer, but he had started out as a part-time tester for Infocom Games right near the founding of the company back in 1979. Then had ended up spearheading the Zork Users Group, which was kind of the fan club for lovers of Infocom text adventures, and then from there became the VP of marketing at the company. He had bounced around through a few other things since then after that, and then was brought on as the COO of Harmonix at the end of 1997, in charge of finance administration, business development, marketing, basically everything that didn't have to do with games. Their board, and I don't know when these people joined the board, also had a very heavy game industry component. They had a 3-person board. One of them was just an investor, Walter Winshall, but the other 2 were Doug Glenn, who had been a marketing executive at LucasArts and Sega, and none other than one Emmanuel Girard, who, as part of the Warner Office of the President back in the late 1970s, was the individual at Warner that had championed the purchase of Atari and had overseen the Atari business as part of the Warner Office of the President. Manny Girard was also on their board. They kind of got this all going. Then they started scouting out individuals within the gaming industry as well. And the first major hire they made in this space, I don't know if he's the very first game person they hired, but the very first major hire they made was an individual by the name of Greg LaPiccolo. Greg LaPiccolo was himself actually fairly new to games at this time, though still a veteran, especially compared to the people at Harmonix who hadn't really done anything yet. Greg LaPiccolo, it's interesting, he had moved to Boston after college, and he was taking on a variety of odd jobs and started just for fun learning bass guitar on the side. He ended up being the bassist for a Boston band by the name of Tribe that never quite broke out to be a mainstream important band, but they were kind of legendary in the Boston bar scene. Got to do some national touring as well, even though they never quite hit. He was with them from 1985 to 1994. Even though they were very popular locally and made a name for themselves, there wasn't a lot of money in it. So LaPiccolo was kind of by 1994 very burned out by doing all of this work and getting no money for it, and started looking around for other odd jobs that he could start taking on to make some more money. At that point, an individual by the name of Rex Bradford, back in the early 80s, then had his own development company as an independent developer after that. He was working with the Looking Glass people, famous for Ultima Underworld by this time. So hooked up LaPiccolo with Looking Glass. Bradford had actually used LaPiccolo to do the music on a game of his that he had done at his studio, a very, very obscure game from 1991 called Bimini Run. Bim with a B, Bimini Run, for poor Mr. Jeffrey that now needs to bring up this game. It's not important. It's really obscure. We're not going to talk about it anymore, but of course we'll put it in the show notes. Rex introduced LaPiccolo to the Looking Glass people, and at this time, the Looking Glass people were looking for somebody to do music and sound on what would become System Shock. This was in about 1994. So LaPiccolo took the job as a consultant at first. Then he actually ended up joining the company full-time, and after System Shock, became a game designer and was the co-designer of the game Thief Dark Project. Quite fitting, since there's a very big audio component to that game. After that, he was headhunted away by Harmonix because they needed a game developer. They needed a head designer so that they could make games now. It was LaPiccolo that came up with their very first real game. He had this idea, because I want to stress that even though they're moving into games now, the purpose is still connecting people with music. They're not getting into games to make first-person shooters and real-time strategy games. They're going to make music games. So LaPiccolo comes up with the idea for their first music game. He was thinking about the ways that people normally interact with music visually. When you interact with music visually, it's very flat and 2D. You're looking at notes on a sheet of paper, or you're watching waveforms go up and down on a stereo system. Like, it's all very flat and very planar. He thought it might be fun. What if you were inside the music? What if you could see the music?
What if I could feel the music?
Like the Lizard Queen. Bonus points if you get that reference.
A very apt person who knows all about the music.
So he envisioned a game where you're in this tubular space, three-dimensional tubular space. You're kind of flowing through the music. So instead of the music kind of being flat and planar notes, you've got these gems coming towards you in this three-dimensional space and all this graphical stuff going on, and you're activating the music. You're switching between tracks on this music to activate various beats and various riffs and generate the music from within. This became their first game, Frequency. Already with this very first game, you see a lot of what ends up going into Guitar Hero. It's not Guitar Hero, not even remotely. For one thing, you're interacting with multiple instrument types, drums and bass and guitar and everything. For another thing, it's entirely controller-based. There's no special peripherals here. There's only 3 lanes of music. But even in this game, they have the concept of the gems, the famous gems that come towards you, forward scroll towards you on the screen. When they get to the bottom of the screen, there's a little circle that represents kind of the timing window. And when your note gets in that circle, you have to press a button to activate that note, to make that note play. You're playing through these patterns of notes as they're scrolling towards you on the screen, which is, in a lot of ways, Guitar Hero. It's simpler because it's 3 inputs. It's simpler in that sense. It's also more complex because you're switching between tracks. You actually have to rotate amongst the different tracks because it is a tubular area. You're not just staying on one track, but it's not Guitar Hero. But a lot of the foundation is already there for how this will work. It's an interesting game.
You have to be honest with the people. It's not tubular. It's an octagon.
Well, sure.
I can see how many tracks there are. There are 8. It's an octagon. You're going down an octagon.
Indeed. That's true. Keeping us honest here at They Create Worlds.
That's right. But it is really very similar to how Guitar Hero and Rock Band did their thing, where you have this lit up track that's very visual, it's very glowy, there's all this stuff going on. Whenever you're hitting things correctly, there's little explosions of light, there's energy waves going around. It's much like looking at a visualizer for any kind of video or music.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very akin to that. Then you're sort of playing along with the visualizer.
And that's certainly not by accident, because as I said, Lupiccolo's like concept is that you are inside the music. So it has very visualizer-like graphics. Absolutely. It's an interesting game, but it's a very hard game to describe. There's no frame of reference to it. If it's like, yeah, there's these circles that come towards you and you have to press a button at the right time and then stuff happens. It's like, okay. And that's when I kill the demon? Like, no, there's no demon. You're inside the music. And is the music the demon? No, the music's just music.
But is the music coming from the demon?
It's like, there's no demon. I'm just saying, it was very hard to describe, and this was a challenge. First of all, it meant that they had a very hard time finding a publisher. Mike Dornbrook is calling up every publisher under the sun, and they can't find anyone that is willing to take the game. Finally, they call Sony, which at this point, we're talking about kind of the very, very end of the PS1 era, with the PS2 era about to start, and indeed, Frequency would end up being a PS2 game. They just kind of cold call, and they're like, we want to talk about a game that we've developed. Wonder of wonders, they're put through to Shu Yoshida, who is the head of development. Like, there's no reason that they should have been put directly through to someone of that stature. These guys that have never done a game before, that are nobodies, they have no relationship with Sony. But somehow they call up and they're put directly through to Yoshida. Yoshida finds their game interesting and decides that Sony will take a chance on it. So they're the only publisher that says yes. So they go with Sony. Sony, in this period of time, they were very receptive to the idea of kind of offbeat kind of games. Obviously, they had their big mainstream franchises as well, but they were always willing to take on something experimental. I'm sure the fact that Parappa the Rapper had been a big hit for Sony, that was a Sony-published game as well, probably influenced them a little bit. They kind of had a better idea than maybe some of the Western publishers did, that a music game under the right circumstances could be a successful product. But for whatever reason, Yoshida took a chance on them. So then, they finished developing the game, whatever. It goes into testing and marketing focus groups and all of this kind of thing. They learn something very interesting. Sony does. And of course, they relay these results to Harmonix. Because when they do these focus groups, First, they will describe the game a little bit to the people that are about to play it, and then they will ask for what their response is, how they feel about that game based on that description. Then after that, they'll play the game. And then after they play it, they'll ask them, how'd you like the game? So they said, it got our lowest scores ever in testing when we told people about the game. Then when they played it, it got some of our highest scores ever.
Marketing has its job cut out for it, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly. So the Harmonix people, being new to this whole game business thing, were like, well, that's great. People love the game. Sony then, like what you hinted at, was like, no, you don't understand. They only like the game once they actually are forced to play it. If we just describe it to them, they want nothing to do with it. This means it will be virtually impossible to market your game. Sure enough, it's not an abject failure that loses them money. We don't have final sales figures, but from what they vaguely said, it sounds like it maybe sold around 100,000 units, give or take, which is small potatoes on the PlayStation. But, it didn't lose money, but it didn't really do anything either. It was basically a flop, but at least a flop that didn't lose them money.
It broke even.
Indeed. And maybe even made a small amount of money. But for a company the size of Sony that was publishing it, it's small potatoes. The Sony people were impressed by the game. They thought it was really cool. And obviously, once you played it, it was cool. So they actually let them do another one. They let them do a sequel by the name of Amplitude, which is basically more of the same, just much better graphics. They've got a kind of spaceship aesthetic going on with the player character, though there really isn't any plot or explanation of why you're a spaceship. It's mostly more of the same. It's better. It has a more mainstream soundtrack. Another thing that they figured was a problem with the original and getting people involved is that a lot of the bands were more obscure. It had a little more mainstream soundtrack. It had better graphics, the same basic gameplay loop that people already kind of liked. And it was also a flop. Released in 2003, and again, just nothing happening. They're not losing money, but they're not being very successful. However, it was continuing to impress people that understood music and understood games and realized what a cool thing this was. Like, Sony continued to be champions, and this also brought them to the attention of Konami. Konami was going to try again to bring some of their music game kind of aesthetic to the United States. They kind of figured out the same thing that Red Octane was about to figure out in the same period. This is a couple years earlier, like 2003. We're not quite to the Red Octane Eureka yet. But they kind of figured out the same thing. It's like, in the United States, we need this to be accessible, and we need it to have some kind of aesthetic. So instead of trying to, they did release DDR games and some of their other rhythm games in the United States as well. It's not like they didn't at all, but they decided that a good way to do this would be to create a karaoke game that was really focused on, again, the player who is the singer being a star performing a song on a stage kind of thing. So they came up with a concept for Karaoke Revolution. They were impressed with Harmonix. There were not a lot of companies in the United States that were doing anything related to music games, because music games do not sell in the United States. So it's not like there were that many choices if Konami was looking for an American developer to do a music game. But nonetheless, they were impressed with Harmonix, with their work on Frequency and Amplitude, and were like, we'd like you to develop this game for us, Karaoke Revolution. So they did. This is kind of the other half of the Guitar Hero thing. Part of the reason we're spending so much time on this is Harmonix has an interesting story, but the other part of it is all of this experience is bringing them closer to the phenomenon that would be Guitar Hero. Because in terms of the gameplay, Karaoke Revolution is nothing like Frequency and Amplitude. Not coincidentally, when we get to the Rock Band period, the gameplay for singing in Karaoke Revolution is basically the gameplay for singing in Rock Band. But the gameplay is nothing like Frequency and Amplitude or Guitar Hero. But the aesthetic now, this is cluing them into the idea that it's not just enough to have a slick music game system. Frequency and Amplitude have slick music game systems, and they're these completely abstract, what the heck is going on, I can see the music kind of stuff. And again, for some people that can work. Like, You know, the kind of people that are into trance music or house music or techno, this idea that you're losing yourself in the synthesia, in the sights and the sounds of the music and going into a flow. I mean, it's not completely illogical, the kind of thing that's going on in frequency and amplitude.
It doesn't have the mass market appeal.
Exactly. We need a mainstream audience. So Karaoke Revolution, these games being fairly successful, they did several of them for Konami, and the series extended even beyond that, without Harmonix doing them at that point. These taught them the importance of packaging, and it also taught them how to do character animation, specifically doing character animations and camera angles and lighting and all of this stuff for performers.
I'm just skipping through here, Karaoke Revolution. If I was just flipping channels here, I would say this is Rock Band, where someone just decided I'm just doing the singing part.
Right.
This is the key thing that really gives it the packaging, where you have someone's on stage. You have this huge crowd cheering them on. You have lights, sound, like a concert. I am controlling a drone or a camera on an arm, looking at all these different angles really close to the action of, yes, this person's a star. And assuming you can even set up your character and how they look, it's like, oh, it looks a little bit like me. I'm on stage. I'm singing. I'm entertaining this huge crowd. That's wonderful. I want more.
Exactly. And, you know, here's the thing. Harmonix was very clever when it did its development contracts. They were always very careful to make sure that they retained the rights to their technology. The look and feel of the games, the graphical elements, the franchises themselves, that kind of stuff was owned by the publisher. But the technology that they used for the scrolling note lanes in frequency and amplitude, the technology they used for their animation and rendering system to capture on-stage performance in Karaoke Revolution, they retained the rights to that underlying technology and to their underlying engines, which means that they could continue to use them in future projects. Very important. Karaoke Revolution does okay. At this point, Sony comes calling again, or, you know, contemporaneously, because I think some of the Karaoke Revolution games continue to come out during this period. Sony comes back to them again. It's like, we still think you guys are cool. We're not doing another music game with you. We took 2 bites at that apple, and it just didn't work out. But we love your inventiveness. We love your way of thinking outside the box about games. We have this new peripheral device called the iToy, the camera for the PlayStation 2 that allowed you to control games using the camera tracking your movements. It's kind of an early form of motion tracking. I mean, there'd been motion tracking even previous to that, but like a prelude to what everyone would get obsessed with on things like the Wii, but a camera rather than a waggle stick.
Or some sort of power glove.
Indeed. I love the power glove, Jeffrey. It's so bad.
It really is. Why can I not control Link and he just dies against the shadow? No one knows.
We should do a Power Glove episode someday. It's actually a very interesting story.
I mean, we should just do one about all the peripherals.
Yeah, we may want to combine it with a couple of other peripherals, because I'm not sure there's enough for a full episode on Power Glove.
You got the Power Glove, you got the pad thing that was used for sports on the Nintendo.
Yeah, the power pad.
You have the light gun, though we kind of talked about that a little bit in our light stuff thing, but it can be a little bit more focused on how Nintendo is.
Yeah, there's an episode there, and it'll give us an excuse to link to the Video Game Historians episode on the hot seat, which is must-see viewing for everybody. And in fact, we can put that in these show notes now, too, because I mentioned it in the episode.
Oh, great. Now I have to figure out where that is. You monster.
Just put in Norm Video Game Historian hot seat. It'll come up. Anywho, so they're like, why don't you make a game for this iToy? They were like, sure, fine. So this is the one time, really, that they make a non-music game. They make a kind of futuristic snowboarding-style game called iToy Antigrav, where you're controlling your ride on this board by moving your body around with motions captured by the camera. A pretty generic game, not particularly interesting or memorable, got very middling review scores. Also, according to the Harmonix founders, sold about 4 times as much as any of their previous games did, which kind of depressed them. It's like all of this stuff that we really care about and is really cool sells barely anything. We create this kind of very generic, what even is this game? And it just sells more than anything of our passion projects. Like, why is this our lives? They were pretty despondent at this point. They still had money. They weren't thinking of closing the company. It wasn't that desperate. But they were pretty despondent at this point. That's when Red Octane came calling. Red Octane and Harmonix already kind of knew each other. Back in the Frequency days, Sony thought it might be kind of interesting to do some kind of custom peripheral for Frequency. Red Octane already at that time, of course, was known for its peripheral devices, and so they kind of arranged a meet-cute there to explore the idea. It didn't come to anything because Frequency ended up not selling very much, and you don't release a peripheral for something that barely sells anything. But they kind of knew each other. So Red Octane contacted Harmonix, knowing they're in the kind of music game business, to see about them working on this guitar game. And coincidentally, truly coincidentally, the Harmonix people had already been kind of thinking along those lines themselves, because they'd done the Karaoke Revolution thing, and they were starting to think about what if we kind of put our rhythm game technology into something where the person is more the star, is more the focus, kind of the same idea that Red Octane was coming to. And in fact, the name Guitar Hero was actually a name that had already been thought up by Harmonix. Now, Harmonix wasn't going to do this thing. It's only because of Red Octane it happened, but the name Guitar Hero actually did come from the Harmonix side.
So you're telling me that, in effect, Red Octane was taking its instrument and looking for something to connect with.
Ha!
While Harmonix was doing the same thing and looking for something to connect with. Then they connected.
Exactly. Because Red Octane knew the peripheral business, so they figured that they could get a peripheral manufactured. And they were trying to get in the publishing business, so they would publish the game. They just needed someone to develop it. Yeah, Harmonix was starting to idly think about maybe doing some kind of guitar game. Red Octane came knocking at that point, and so yeah, they got together and decided to do this thing. It was insane that this ever happened. The development budget was $1.75 million. Even in 2004, 2005 video game development money, that was nothing. They only had 9 months to get the game done because they really needed to get it out in time for the holidays. For something like this, holiday sales were especially important because it was going to be more expensive than the average game because you had the guitar bundled with it. So it's not the kind of impulse buy that you just go down on a random weekend in the middle of the year with some pocket money and are like, I want a game. Give me one fine game, please, Mr. Game Store Man. So they only had 9 months to develop it. It was going to be expensive. It was going to take up huge amounts of shelf space. It was in a genre nobody cared about, put out by a publisher who had basically never published before, developed by a developer that had never had a successful game in their life. There is no reason any of this should have worked. Said it at the top of the hour, and I say it again here. There is no reason that this thing should work, except through their trials and tribulations and their experiments and their failures, Harmonix knew how to make a really good music game. One of the people in the oral history, I forget who, like Hester did, makes the point that if Guitar Hero had been Harmonix's first music game, it would have probably been terrible, or at least mediocre. But they'd made Frequency, they'd made Amplitude, they'd made some Karaoke Revolution games. They'd refined their system. From the very beginning, within a month, they had a prototype together. Very, very basic prototype, but they could already use some of the technology they had. It was put together by Dan Schmidt, their lead systems programmer, who was another Looking Glass hire. It was very, very simple. They hacked together some kind of guitar peripheral. They got a music track in the game and had a very basic two-dimensional, not the gems in the final game, just two-dimensional basic geometric shape notes scrolling down the screen, playing along to the music, and had a system in place where if you missed a note, it interrupted the music. So it really did feel like you were playing it rather than following along to a track that was going to do what it was going to do no matter what you did. Even that very first demo, minimal graphics, no aesthetic in it yet. Not all of the gameplay features that would be in the final project. Even that very first primitive demo was insanely fun to play because they already knew what they were doing with music games. From that moment on, most of the people at the company believed that it would be a very good product. They weren't convinced it would be a hit. They'd been down this road before and they'd been burned, but they were convinced that at least they were going to have something that was very fun. So, the basics is basically, it is a combination. I'm oversimplifying because it's not quite this, but the basic game is just a combination of Amplitude plus Karaoke Revolution. It's taking kind of the note tracks and scrolling notes of Amplitude, combining it with the I'm on stage aesthetic of Karaoke Revolution. Obviously, there's more to it than that. They had to do other design stuff. But I think this is the only way you get this done in 9 months and still have an incredibly good game, is that you basically had all of those elements already. Then on top of that, they layered their own experiences and their own love of rock music, because since Harmonix is a company by musicians for musicians, a lot of the people in the company were musicians, had bands, or were in bands. We mentioned Greg LaPiccolo in Tribe, but he was far from the only one. There were a lot of musicians in the company and a lot of people connected to the rock scene. Nobody who ever became big, but they were still connected to rock and roll music, and they really knew that scene so well. One of the other kind of big heroes in this aspect, I mean, there are many people that worked on the game, many individual contributions that are incredibly important, but kind of the other aspect of this aesthetic aspect, really came in large part from the art director on the game, Ryan Lesser. Ryan Lesser, an artist, obviously, because he's heading the art, he's the art director, but he had grown up in the rock and roll world. He had been a metalhead in the 80s as a teenager. He was a poster artist. He had actually designed rock posters before. He knew that aesthetic. So his goal with the aesthetics of the game was basically to make it a living rock and roll poster, like really capture all of those aesthetics from rock posters, and then also capture what he remembered as this kind of pseudo-machismo, his own words, of 80s hair metal, which was big and brash and very working class, and on its surface, even perhaps very hostile and threatening and offensive, but actually underneath that surface veneer had a really big heart. He wanted larger than life kind of characters. If a character was a bigger character, he should be big and bulky with huge shoulders. If it was a thinner character, they should be almost comically slim. He wanted everything to be just a little off kilter. Wonky art style is what he called it. No right angles, nothing perfectly symmetrical. Everything just a little bit askew, which he felt really captured rock energy and 80s hair metal kind of energy. He even got some very notable people in the poster industry to contribute graphics, including the graphic designer who designed the very famous Hope poster for the Obama campaign, the Obama presidential campaign, contributed little posters and art assets to the game. So on top of this veneer of the Amplitude gameplay and the performative aspects of Karaoke Revolution, you just had this very solid, very focused rock and roll aesthetic created by people that actually live that aesthetic. And this went into the design of the peripheral and the tracks to the game as well, because since they were musicians, the goal is not to reproduce exactly what is going on in the song. The goal is to make you feel like you are a rock musician. When it came to the guitar controller, Guitar Freaks, I believe, only had like 3 buttons. You only really have 4 fingers that you use when you're playing the guitar on the fret, because you're using one hand on the fret. One hand to strum, one on the fret. So that would logically make you think that there would be 4 buttons. But Ryan Lesser thought it would be a lot better. He was the one that kind of did the first aesthetic pass of the controller. He thought it would be a lot better to have 5 buttons, because then you could create 3 power chord positions with the fingering. You'd have to move the fingers around a little bit, and that would feel more like you're moving up and down a fret, like playing a real guitar. A non-musician or someone not thinking about it from that perspective might have been like 3 or 4 buttons is enough. But they went for that 5th button, which wasn't necessarily intuitive. But I think, that musicianship kind of comes into play for that. When it comes to authoring the tracks, most rock and roll tracks, they don't just have a single guitar playing. There could be some rhythm guitar going on here. There could be some lead guitar going on here. There could be a couple of guitarists up on stage that you could be doing some looping in the studio so that, multiple guitars are playing at once, the same person, laid down all the tracks or whatever. It's not like most of these songs have a single through track of guitar. There's a lot of guitar going on. It wasn't just about translating note for note like a guitar chart into the game. They had to pick at any given moment what they thought the most fun and most interesting guitar action going on was and seamlessly shift between these various instruments and various rhythms that are being played to kind of find the fun, which is another area where their guitar expertise came in really handy. Their musicianship came in really handy. They also knew that they wanted the guitar to be a prop that was more than just a controller that happened to be shaped like a guitar. They were absolutely insistent that there be a whammy bar that actually worked on the guitar. That was a bit of a challenge, but they got that to work. And they knew, because rock stars, when they're playing guitar, they're gyrating around, they're moving their guitar around. They wanted to capture that feel as well of you should be moving your guitar, not just keeping it static, because a rock star isn't going to just stand up there static unless they're a shoegazer or something, particular genre. So that's where they came up with the idea of star power, where we could add another element in where if you tilt the guitar, we can put a sensor in it, a tilt sensor. And if you tilt the guitar, it activates a special star power mode that allows you to get more points. And then it adds a little strategic depth because you have to decide when best to deploy it to maximize your point gain, all of that kind of thing. All of this kind of comes together to create the game we know as Guitar Hero, which is just a really fun fantasy way to experience playing a guitar without actually playing a guitar. I mean, you kind of really do feel in a way like you're a rock star without actually being a rock star. They get the game done, 9 months, 1.75 million. Red Octane scrounges up the guitars. They don't have a lot of money either, but they go around to a bunch of factories in China, make a bunch of different deals to get guitars shipped in to the States. Red Octane plans to do the packaging themselves of the game with the guitar once it gets there. The only thing left to do is to try to get people to actually play this bloody thing. Now they just have to get this on store shelves because, again, it's an expensive product. They know word of mouth is going to be incredibly important. In 2005, as they're getting closer to release, they start trying to gain interest within the video game press. By this time, kind of the online press has become a lot more important in a lot of the ways than the old print magazines, particularly in the United States. So they really target GameSpot and IGN, which at the time are the two biggest online outlets for video game news and reviews. They send them demo units, and it takes a lot of convincing to get them to actually play the demo games. Because again, on paper, it's like, what even is this? Why is this happening? It's this weird plastic peripheral, and it's this big box, and music games never sell. Nobody cares for music games in the United States. Why am I going to bother with this? The folks at Red Octane keep pushing on them until finally Tal Blevins, who was a co-founder of IGM and was their editorial director, he was like, just play it once. That's all I'm asking. You don't have to do anything else. Just play it once. Finally wears him down, and he finally plays it and has a blast with it. Then puts together a video of him and another guy playing it, kind of dressed up as rock stars, kind of starts the viral marketing. They take it to E3 and they demo it privately. It's not on the show floor, but they take people back to demo it privately. They start getting huge word of mouth. It looks like they might have a hit on their hands if they can just get stores to take it. And that's the other challenge, because it's going to be a big box. GameStops are small. Mass market retailers like Walmart and Target have pretty regimented store shelves that are not necessarily going to be suited for unusually sized product. Toys R Us basically turns them down outright. They're not interested. GameStop is interested. They start taking a shine to it at E3. But their big champion is actually Best Buy, which at this time still matters a little bit. They present the game. I mean, they're presenting the game to all the buyers over time. They present the game to the buyers at Best Buy. There are two buyers because they have separate buyers for video games and for video game accessories. Two different people. And they basically look at each other and are like, is this a video game or is it a video game accessory? Because there's a game here, Guitar Hero, but it also comes with this huge controller. The buyer for accessories, a relatively new buyer, young buyer by the name of Casey Sondriel, after playing the game, is immediately taken with it and says, fine, I'll put it on my shelf. I'll take a chance on it. The Best Buy deal ends up being their important deal because Best Buy does something that a lot of other stores aren't interested in doing, and that's that she decides that in order to sell the game, the best thing to do is for people to experience it. So she has Best Buy set up demo stations of the game in the store. Demo stations for games are not a new concept. I mean, they existed even all the way back into the 70s. There were demo stations for the Channel F and the Atari VCS and the Intellivision. That's nothing new. Two things. First of all, most stores don't do demo stations. Only specialty stores that have enough space tend to do them. So a Best Buy will do one. A GameStop generally doesn't. Certainly a Walmart or a Target are probably not going to. Second of all, even if demo stations are often used, the idea of setting up a demo station that is really only for this one game that has this separate controller that you have to keep track of as well, that's even more of a non-starter. The fact that Casey had this kind of brainwave to set up demo stations was incredibly important because she was right. When people played the game, it's a similar situation to amplitude and frequency. I think Guitar Hero as a concept is easier to explain than either of those games. But it's still one of these things that if you just tell them about it, it's like, yeah, you pretend to be a rock star and you have this plastic fake guitar and you kind of use that and you play along to music. People didn't know what to make of that. But when you played it and you realized what fun it was and you realized how much it really did immerse you in this idea of being a rock star, then you fell in love with it. So Best Buy with its demo station saw big numbers of pre-orders. Walmart soon discovered the same thing. At Walmart, there were some individual stores that on their own initiative had set up demo stations, and they realized that stores with demo stations were selling way more units than stores without them. GameStop, which did agree to take the game, GameStop was not going to do demo stations. GameStop stores are small. But as the Red Octane people explain the oral history with Blake Hester, even though the head manager of the GameStop stores, whatever his title was not going to do demo stations, he also knew that if individual stores decided they wanted to do something, he would not normally contradict them. He gave a lot of autonomy to his store managers. So they went to GameStop's Store Manager Expo, the convention specifically for GameStop store managers, and just got a bunch of names and addresses of GameStop managers and started appealing to managers directly, asking them if they would take demo units. A few of them did. And then the head guy, once he saw the numbers, it's like places with demo stations sell way more than those without demo stations. He was finally like, okay, we're going to do demo stations in all GameStop stores. So they had word of mouth coming out of E3. They had demo stations for the game, which was a highly unusual practice. So there were a lot of ways for people to kind of connect with this game. It was also the very, very beginning of YouTube, 2005. So there was also a little bit of the game going viral on YouTube with people recording videos of them playing the game, sometimes dressed up in costume and whatever else. It was also kind of a perfect time to release something like this. 2005, the PlayStation 2, and it is a PlayStation 2 game. The PlayStation 2 is long in the tooth, but it has a large install base. The PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 have come out. We's still a year away. But only early adopters are buying those systems, especially the PS3, which is horrifically expensive. 360 is also expensive, but the PS3 is horrifically expensive. Most people are probably not buying a game system this year. But everybody who's interested in games has a PS2. I mean, that system just dominated the marketplace. So when it comes time to be like, what would be a nice big ticket Christmas present? Well, people aren't really getting 360s or PS3s yet. Obviously, some people are, but the mass public isn't yet. It was kind of a perfect Christmas present kind of item. Just a little more expensive, a little fancier, and they did everything they did to keep the price down. They sold it for only like $70. They were keeping their margins really low so that they didn't have to raise the price very high. They wanted to get people on board with this concept. So even though it was more expensive than the standard game, it wasn't $100. It wasn't $150. They were still keeping it fairly reasonable. It was a little fancier, a little bit of a bigger ticket item that made sense as a Christmas present in a market that already had massive penetration of PS2 consoles and where people were not really shifting to the next generation consoles yet. So it was an almost immediate hit, and then it kept growing from there. In fact, it would have even been a bigger hit, except Red Octane had no money. They were scraping the bottom of the barrel just to get the units shipped that they were able to ship. They couldn't increase production because they didn't have the money or the resources or the infrastructure. Within a month or so, retailers were starting to clamor. It's like, we need thousands more units this week. You know, the one example they give is like Best Buy or GameStop, I forget which one, saying, I need 8,000 units next week. It's Best Buy. They're like, I need 8,000 units next week. And it's like, we will have 5,000 units next week, and you're going to have to split them with GameStop. So you'll get about 2,500 units. The first game was really scarce. Like, more people definitely got into it, and I was definitely one of them. More people got into the game with Guitar Hero 2 than with Guitar Hero, because even though Guitar Hero, the original, was a hit, it was ridiculously supply constrained, which really probably only played to their advantage when they released Guitar Hero 2, because then everyone was clamoring the next year for Guitar Hero 2, because Guitar Hero was almost impossible to find. So it's like, you know, that game everyone was talking about that they loved? Well, here's the updated version. So, of course, Guitar Hero 2 is a big hit as well. Unfortunately, it's during this time that the seeds of destruction are sown, and we're not going to spend too much time on the rest of that story, but we do want to cover it very briefly. Because at this point, Harmonix and Red Octane, who had worked in such great harmony on Guitar Hero, and were already starting to work together on Guitar Hero 2, were split up by the intervention of the company Activision. We've already talked about Activision in this time period. We did several episodes on the company and Bobby Kotick. So we've already covered this story a little bit, but we haven't covered it specifically from the Guitar Hero perspective. At this time, Activision is becoming a pretty big deal. They've had the Tony Hawk thing, they've had the Call of Duty thing. They're starting to become a bigger company. But there's so much more room for them to grow. They're still trying to grow bigger and bigger and find more mainstream hits. Guitar Hero comes out, and pretty soon all of the hardcore gamers at various Activision studios are absolutely hooked on the game. The head of Activision Studios, Ron Dornick, notices this. He buys the game for his own children at Christmas. His children are completely hooked on it, and in his own words, even his wife, he discovered, was sneaking in sessions from time to time, a non-gamer. So he was like, that's interesting. And it's being made by this little piddly publisher, Red Octane? Who even are they? I mean, he might have known who they are. I'm just saying that for dramatic effect now. But it's like, who even are these people? This is a major property that is only going to get bigger. And this small publisher can't possibly be ready to keep up with that demand. I bet we can take this over. So Dornick approaches Red Octane and asks, hey, we'd like to buy you. Your game's incredible. We'd like to put our muscle behind the game. We want to buy you. The Red Octane people were basically like, this is great. We have no money. We're barely scraping by. Let's sell out. So they end up buying Red Octane. Harmonix, meanwhile, has also gotten a lot of attention through this, and they end up being purchased by MTV Networks, a subsidiary of our old friend Viacom from our Virgin Games episode not so long ago. Bobby Kotick, in a speech that he gave once while he was still CEO of Activision, talking about a little bit about the past, said that he felt their biggest mistakes was they did not look closely enough into the Guitar Hero franchise before buying Red Octane to realize that the actual creative talent was at Harmonix and that Red Octane were just the publishers. And I say just the publishers. It was their idea. They got the guitar peripherals together. I want to be clear, this would have never happened without Red Octane. But in terms of the more valuable company to have in your stable, it probably would have been more valuable for them to also scoop up Harmonix, not just Red Octane. That doesn't mean that they couldn't have worked together still. But there was a problem, and that problem was Viacom. As the Red Octane people found out, Activision did not do business with Viacom. This stemmed from a lawsuit that had happened just a couple of years ago. Activision had the Star Trek license. They had gotten the Star Trek license for the same reason they get everything, to make some money. They signed that license with assurances that Viacom, which owned Paramount, we talked about that whole mess in our Virgin Games episode. Paramount, of course, the rights holder for Star Trek. They were guaranteed as part of their contract that Viacom would be continuing to exploit the property over the course of the licensing deal. by which I mean putting out new Star Trek TV shows, new Star Trek movies, et cetera, because a license in many ways is only as good as the material that's put out to exploit the license. I mean, obviously Star Trek is popular, but as with anything else, Star Trek is more popular when there's new stuff coming out than when there's not. They want to be able to create games based on the latest television shows, the latest movies, the latest characters. They don't just want to be doing back catalog stuff. Well, this corresponded with kind of the great fallow period of Star Trek. Voyager aired its last episode in 2001. Enterprise started up at about the same time, but was not the same level of hit as other shows had been. The Star Trek movie franchise was completely petering out. The Next Generation movies, with the exception of the Borg one, First Contact, had not really been all of that successful. Star Trek Nemesis in 2002 ended up being the last one. And that was 4 years after the previous one, Insurrection, which had also not been all that great. There was a real fallow period in Star Trek. Activision was not happy because they had gotten that license with assurances that the Star Trek franchise was going to keep boldly going. So Activision actually sued Viacom for not releasing enough Star Trek stuff. Kind of silly, but there it is. Sued them in 2003, settled the suit in 2005, and we're basically resolved we are not working with Viacom again, which precluded a continued relationship with Harmonix, which was now owned by Viacom. This is where you get the great split. Activision continues the Guitar Hero series, at first through the developer Neversoft, famous for the Tony Hawk games. There were a lot of big rock and roll fans there. They were fans of the series. Red Octane was basically given their opportunity to pick what development studio they would work with. Various studios within the company pitched them for the project. The Neversoft people were the most enthusiastic. They even had a rough demo set up and ready to show by the time the Red Octane people came. Neversoft ended up doing it. Guitar Hero 3 was the biggest game in the series in terms of success. You could tell it was made by a developer that didn't have the same kind of musical acumen that Harmonix did. Activision got better some in some of their subsequent games, but Guitar Hero 3, there's a lot of note progressions and chord combinations and whatnot that feel more game-like. It's more about creating challenging gameplay than about feeling like authentically playing some of these songs. It's did well, it's fine, but it felt like a letdown to some of us who were into these games compared to Guitar Hero 2. Harmonix, of course, went on to do the full band experience. They do Rock Band. Then each of these companies just releases too many games over too short a period of time. The market oversaturates, kind of peaks around 2007, then starts a slow decline. Activision finally gives up on the whole thing in 2010. After getting more and more diminishing returns on various sequels and track packs and specific band-related games like Metallica and Van Halen. Harmonix, because they're really wedded to the whole music game thing, they tough it out for a little longer, even long enough to put out a Rock Band 4 on next generation systems, PS4 and Xbox One. But they just kind of oversaturate the market. But for a brief period of time, those games were the games to be. I mean, they turned Activision into a much larger company and probably paved the way. Ron Dornick thinks that without Guitar Hero, they would have never been able to do the Vivendi merger that made them the largest third-party publisher and continued to catapult them to even greater heights. Of course, we cover that in our Bobby Kotick episodes. There was a period of time when a song appearing in Rock Band or Guitar Hero could cause a band's sales to jump by several 100%. Guitar Hero 3 basically made the band Dragon Force when their song Through the Fire and Flames was included. Aerosmith, there was a Guitar Hero Aerosmith game specifically focused on the band, and apparently Aerosmith made more money on the royalties from that game than they ever made on any of their records. Some of that is a testament to the way artists are screwed over by the record business, but some of that is also a testament to how powerful these games were. Of course, very famously, Harmonix even managed to get the Beatles, whose music is almost never licensed to anybody. They were able to do a Beatles Rock Band game. That, interestingly, came about because of their MTV connection. The head of MTV Networks, Van Toffler, knew the Harrison family, as in George Harrison of the Beatles, who has passed away by this point, but he knew the family. He was at their house one day, and Danny Harrison, George Harrison's son, who was also a musician himself, was talking about how he hadn't gotten any sleep the night before because he'd stayed up playing Guitar Hero all night. That got Van like, we just bought the guys who made that game. And that started, it took a few more years for that to bear fruit, but that started the process of actually getting the Beatles on board, the surviving Beatles and the families of the deceased Beatles on board to do the Beatles Rock Band game. Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney even came to E3 the year that the Beatles Rock Band was coming out. Like, these were huge for a period of time, but they were expensive. There were only so many permutations on the gameplay. People that were really into this could get more variety by, more songs, more of their favorite bands. Obviously, Guitar Hero followed Rock Band into the full band setup, so you had drums and singing and all of that as well. There were only so many permutations you could do on it. They were releasing too many games into the market too fast. Activision was more guilty of that than Harmonix was, but Harmonix was also releasing an awful lot of stuff. They're not blameless in this either. There just wasn't a lot of place for the genre to grow, and it only go down. I mean, the Great Recession happened. People were tightening their belts. These games were big and expensive, so that was a logical area to cut back. There was oversaturation in the market. As with any fad that captures the general public, people were excited about it for a while. Then a lot of the general public that were interested in it moved on to the next thing. Obviously, there were some diehards like myself that continued with it, but that's not enough to sustain something that's that expensive, that has that many moving pieces, dealing with all those bands and record labels and peripheral manufacturers and all of this. So it ended up only being a moment in time. Moment in time, I hope, comes again sometime, because I really enjoyed those kind of games. But I mean, there's really nothing like it on the market right now. There's some stuff going on in Fortnite that is a little bit rhythm gamey, but there's not a lot going on in the market right now. It's kind of dead. But for one brief shining moment, it was kind of one of the be-alls and end-alls of the video game industry. Guitar Hero became a $1 billion franchise and propelled Activision to one of the most powerful game companies in the world. And Alex bought way more DLC than he cares to admit.
How much DLC did we do?
It's in the 4 digits. Not the 3 digits. Definitely the 4 digits. The low 4 digits, but that happened. Red Octane did not survive. It was ultimately closed down by Activision in 2010. Harmonix is still around. They're no longer owned by MTV, but they're still out there. They're still trying to connect people with music in whatever way they can. It's kind of ending on a whimper, but that's just kind of what it was. It got really, really big, and then it was gone almost as fast as it appeared.
I'm not sure if some of the younger listeners might fully appreciate this, but the penetration was very deep, where you had people who weren't into games getting consoles and getting Rock Band and Guitar Hero sets because they just wanted to play the music, or it made a good family or group activity.
Yeah.
You've met people who are like renting equipment and they go like, yeah, we just want to rent out an entire thing with speakers and big screens and all the Guitar Hero and Rock Band you have.
Let me tell you, I mean, I can't remember if I mentioned this on the show before. I know I've mentioned it to you, but I can't remember if I mentioned it on the show. My partner at the time worked for an AV services company. So they had a warehouse, full of equipment. And every so often on a weekend when there was nobody around, the company was fine with it. Like, we weren't sneaking in. A group of us would go into the warehouse and we would get out the big speakers, like the same kind of speakers that the rock stars use. And we would get a big projection screen, not even just like a widescreen television. One time we even built a giant screen and we would have a Rock Band party with all of those bells and whistles. And it was pretty fun, let me tell you.
Let me imagine.
And, it was a moment in time, too. I mean, people don't really talk about this together, but I mean, the Wii was hitting big at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there was this brief moment here where video games were hitting a mainstream audience that was bigger and more expansive than the normal video game audience. The kind of people that were drawn in by the Wii were probably also being drawn in by Rock Band and Guitar Hero. Now, those games appeared on the Wii, but the Wii was not as powerful a system as the PS3, the Xbox 360. I don't think Guitar Hero specifically was a big seller on the Wii, or Rock Band was a big seller on the Wii, though they probably got some sales there. there was kind of like this mainstream moment, and Rock Band and Guitar Hero kind of epitomized that at the same time the Wii epitomized that. And then a combination of fads running their course and the Great Recession causing a lot of belt tightening just kind of drew people away from both those fads. I mean, the Wii sales started to collapse at the end of its life, and obviously the Wii U didn't do nearly as well. And then Guitar Hero and Rock Band sales started to collapse, and those properties went mostly dormant. There was this mainstream moment in games, and those franchises took real advantage of it.
Well, as we put away our guitars, our falling apart drum sets, and those mysterious people over there wanting to put us in straitjackets for some sort of resort, where shall we flee to in our next episode?
Well, I think it's time we take a look once again at the Japanese arcade scenes we did just a few episodes ago with our episode on the control law, and look at another icon of that industry, one Masanobu Endo. Endo's games, while somewhat known in the United States, are definitely not as big over here. He's no Yu Suzuki or Shigeru Miyamoto to a Western audience, but in Japan, he's revered almost as much as those two figures. This is for two reasons. First of all, he has always been an incredible mentor and has always been willing to take young designers under his wing and to talk game design with anybody under the sun, so that gave him a certain thing. But then he is also responsible for two of the seminal early 1980s Japanese coin-op games, Xevious and Tower of Druaga. They came out at right in the kind of the trough of the crash in the United States, so neither one was that big here. Xevious was definitely bigger than Druaga, but these two games really transformed in a lot of ways Japanese game design, not just in coin-op, but even beyond. And there's a lot of things that those games did that carried on in the later 8-bit games at Nintendo and other companies, and then further on from that. Definitely an individual worthy of study. There have been enough Japanese interviews that have been translated into English now that we can kind of do justice to him and his games. So that seems like a great next topic for They Create Worlds.
And with that, we will see you next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where you have links to some of the things we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have a podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. I tried to fix Alex's drums once. I was unsuccessful. We were both sad.